The warden didn't shake Johnny Cash's hand. He grabbed his wrist, leaning across the oak desk with eyes hard as flint. "Mr. Cash," he whispered, the smell of stale coffee and fear on his breath. "You are walking into a cafeteria filled with 1,000 convicted murderers, rapists, and thieves. We have removed the tables so they can sit closer to you. That means there is nothing between your throat and their hands but air." He paused, looking at the black coat Johnny was wearing, the uniform of the outlaw. "My guards have orders. If they rush the stage, if you incite a riot, we will not use tear gas. We will open fire, and we won't be aiming for their legs." Johnny didn't flinch. He just adjusted his guitar strap, popped a pill from his pocket into his dry mouth, and smiled a smile that looked a lot like a wolf baring its teeth. "Warden," Johnny rasped, "if they rush the stage, I'm going with them." January 13th, 1968, Folsom State Prison, California. This wasn't a publicity stunt. It was a desperate gamble by a man whose career was circling the drain, drowning in amphetamines and bad decisions. Johnny Cash went inside those walls to save his soul, but he almost started a revolution. "We are taking you inside the maximum security unit for the most dangerous concert ever recorded. The day Johnny Cash turned a prison into a church and terrified the establishment. Where are you watching from? Tell us in the comments. And here is the question. Was Johnny Cash a hero for giving these men a voice, or was he reckless for lighting a match in a room full of gasoline? Subscribe now, because the story of what happened before the recording started has never been fully told. The bus ride up to the prison gates was silent, a funeral procession rolling through the California fog. Inside the vehicle, the air was thick with smoke and nerves. Johnny sat near the window, his knee bouncing with the frantic chemical energy of the pills he had swallowed at breakfast. He looked terrible. His skin was gray, pockmarked and sweaty, his eyes sunken deep into his skull like two burnt holes in a blanket. He hadn't slept properly in days. The Columbia Records executives sitting across from him looked like men marching to the gallows. They knew this was a mistake. They had begged him not to do it. "Who buys a live album recorded in a dungeon?" they asked. "Who wants to hear applause from men who might never see the sun again?" But Johnny stared out at the granite walls of Folsom, rising out of the earth like a tombstone, and he felt a magnetic pull. He wasn't going there to perform for them. He was going there because he felt like he was one of them. The only difference was that his cage had wheels. As the bus hissed to a halt at the outer perimeter, the reality of the situation hit the band like a physical blow. This wasn't a venue. There were no dressing rooms. There was no green room with catering. There were sniper towers. Men with high-powered rifles watched them disembark, their silhouettes cut out against the gray sky. The soundscape was terrifying. No cheering fans, just the mechanical clanking of chains, the buzz of electric gates, and the shouting of orders. Johnny stepped off the bus, his black coat billowing in the cold wind. He looked up at the guard tower. He didn't look down. He lifted his chin in a gesture of defiance that the snipers likely tracked through their scopes. He was bringing a weapon inside, but it was made of wood and wire. They were processed, like new inmates. Pat-downs, ID checks. The guards were not fans. To them, Johnny Cash was a troublemaker, a drug addict who glamorized the very criminals they risked their lives to cage. One guard, a burly man with a scar running down his neck, spat on the ground near Johnny's boot. "Don't get them riled up, Cash," he warned, his hand resting on his baton. "They haven't seen a woman or heard a song in 20 years. They're dry timber. You throw a spark, and we all burn." Johnny just looked at him, his eyes glazed but sharp. "Music is fire, officer," he muttered. "It burns out the infection." He walked past the guard, deeper into the belly of the beast. The deeper they went, the darker it got. The air grew stale, smelling of bleach, unwashed bodies, and decades of misery. The walls seemed to sweat. The venue was the cafeteria. It was a concrete box designed to amplify noise, a nightmare for a sound engineer but perfect for a riot. The tables had been folded up. The inmates were already there, a sea of blue denim, 1,000 men. They weren't sitting in neat rows, they were packed in, crouching, standing, leaning. The energy in the room was nuclear. It was static electricity so thick you could taste the ozone. These men were starved for stimulation, and Johnny Cash was a steak dinner. As the band set up their modest equipment on a small wooden riser, barely a foot off the ground, the prisoners watched in silence. It was a predatory silence. They were sizing him up. Was he a tourist? Was he a fake? A rich star coming to look at the animals in the zoo? Or was he the real deal? Johnny stood backstage, which was just a dirty kitchen area, pacing like a tiger. His mouth was dry, a side effect of the amphetamines. He reached for a glass of water. A prisoner working in the kitchen handed him a tin cup. The water was cloudy. Johnny drank it anyway. He needed the edge. He needed the grit. He looked at his band, the Tennessee Three. They were terrified. Luther Perkins, the guitar player, looked like he wanted to jump out a window. "Just follow me," Johnny told them, his voice dropping an octave. "And don't stop playing. If we stop, they have time to think." It was a tactical instruction. He knew that the rhythm was the only thing keeping the chaos in check. He was about to walk into the lion's den, and he didn't have a whip. He only had a song about shooting a man just to watch him die. The warden stepped up to the microphone to introduce him. "Gentlemen," the warden barked, his voice echoing harshly off the concrete, "keep your seats. Follow the rules." The inmates booed, a low, rumbling sound that shook the floor. They hated the warden. The tension spiked into the red zone. The guards along the walls unbuttoned the straps on their holsters. This was the moment. It could go either way. A riot could start right now, before a single note was played. Then, the curtain, just a bedsheet hung on a wire, parted, and the man in black stepped into the harsh fluorescent light, turning his back on the guards and facing the killers. I have slowed the narrative down to capture the exact moment the fuse was lit. The focus here is on the psychological shift, how Johnny turned a room of hostile strangers into a brotherhood, and the terrifying realization by the guards that they were outnumbered. He stood there for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. He looked out at the faces in the front row, men with spiderweb tattoos on their necks, men with noses broken so many times they looked like flattened clay, men who hadn't seen a soft thing in 20 years. They were looking at his boots. They were looking at his guitar. They were looking for the fear. If he flinched, they would eat him alive. If he patronized them, they would boo him off the stage. Johnny didn't do either. He shifted his weight, the floorboards creaking under his black boots, and leaned into the mic. He didn't shout. He didn't preach. He simply stated a fact in a voice that sounded like it had been dragged over a mile of gravel. "Hello," he rumbled, the bass frequency vibrating in the chest cavities of the guards standing 30 feet away. "I'm Johnny Cash." The reaction wasn't immediate applause. It was a shockwave. For a split second, the prisoners were stunned that he was actually there, in the flesh, looking as rough and battered as they did. Then the cafeteria exploded. It wasn't the high-pitched screaming of teenage girls at a Beatles concert. It was a low, guttural roar, a sound made by 1,000 men shouting from the diaphragm. It was a masculine, aggressive wall of noise. The guards along the perimeter flinched, their hands instinctively dropping to their batons. The warden, standing in the wings, went pale. This was the sound of a riot starting. This was the sound of control being lost. But before the guards could step forward, Luther Perkins hit the E string of his Fender Esquire, and the boom-chicka-boom rhythm cut through the chaos like a machete. The song was Folsom Prison Blues. It was the most audacious choice possible. He was singing their own misery back to them. "I hear the train a-comin'. It's rollin' round the bend." The rhythm was relentless, a chugging steam engine that drove the song forward. Johnny attacked the guitar. He wasn't strumming it. He was punishing it. He held the neck like it was a weapon, angling it towards the crowd like a rifle. Sweat began to pour down his face immediately, the amphetamines spiking his body temperature, making his eyes wide and manic. He looked like a preacher possessed by a demon. The prisoners leaned in. The gap between the stage and the first row of inmates was less than 5 feet. There was no barrier, no security line, just air. When he hit the line, "I ain't seen the sunshine since I don't know when," a collective shudder went through the room. He wasn't just singing lyrics, he was speaking their truth. He was validating their suffering. You could see the change in the prisoners' eyes. The hostility evaporated. replaced by a fierce, fanatical loyalty. They realized he wasn't a tourist. He was one of them. He understood the cage. He understood the darkness. A man in the third row, serving life for armed robbery, stood up, tears streaming down a face scarred by knife fights. He screamed, "Tell him, Johnny! Tell him!" The guards tensed. Standing up was against the rules. The protocol was to drag him out. But the guards didn't move. They were paralyzed. They realized with terrifying clarity that if they tried to remove one man now, they would have to fight all 1,000 of them. Johnny Cash had just seized command of Folsom Prison. Then came the line that made the record executives sweat blood, the line that the warden had warned him about. "But I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die." In the recording you hear on the album, there is a cheer. But in the room, in that exact second, there was a moment of visceral, electric recognition. It was a dangerous confession. It was the darkest thought in the human brain, spoken out loud under bright lights. The prisoners went feral. They stomped their feet on the concrete floor, a rhythmic thunder that shook the dust from the ceiling rafters. Boom, boom, boom. It sounded like a war drum. The sniper in the catwalk above adjusted his rifle scope, centering the crosshairs on Johnny's chest. The instructions were clear. If he incites violence, take him out. Johnny looked up. He saw the glint of the glass lens in the darkness above. He didn't look away. He snarled the next verse directly at the sniper. He was daring them. He was untouchable. The show became a blur of raw energy. He played Cocaine Blues, a song about murder and running from the law. He played 25 Minutes to Go, a countdown to an execution. Every song was a middle finger to the establishment. He drank water from the dirty tin cup, spitting it onto the stage floor. He told jokes about the warden's yellow streak. The prisoners laughed, a free, raucous laughter that hadn't been heard in that cafeteria in decades. It was a release of pressure so massive, it felt like the roof was going to blow off. Johnny was feeding them energy, and they were feeding it back, a feedback loop of adrenaline and rebellion. He was sweating so much his black coat was soaked through, clinging to his frame. He looked like he was melting, burning up in the atmosphere of his own creation. But as the set went on, the physical toll of the drugs began to show. His hands were shaking, his voice was cracking, turning into a dry rasp. He was running on fumes. He paused between songs, leaning heavily on the mic stand, gasping for air. The room went silent, watching him. Was he crashing? Was the high wearing off? The warden took a step forward from the wings, signaling to the guards to prepare to shut it down. He thought Johnny was done. He thought the man in black was about to collapse. But Johnny lifted his head, eyes burning with a sudden, terrifying clarity, and pointed a shaking finger at the locked doors at the back of the room, shouting a command that made the guards reach for their guns. The command Johnny shouted wasn't attack. It wasn't break the doors. He screamed a name. "Glenn Shirley!" The shout echoed off the concrete walls, bouncing between the sniper towers and the prisoners. The guards froze. The inmates turned their heads, a confused ripple moving through the sea of blue denim. In the front row, a man froze. Glenn Shirley, inmate number A59708, serving time for armed robbery, looked up with eyes wide as saucers. He was a hard man, a man who had seen the inside of solitary confinement, but in this moment, he looked like a terrified child. The night before, a prison chaplain had slipped Johnny a demo tape, a grainy, rough recording of a song Shirley had written in his cell. Johnny had stayed up all night in the motel, listening to it, learning it, letting the lyrics bleed into his own bloodstream. Johnny leaned into the mic, his voice dropping to a reverent whisper that carried more weight than his shouting. "This song was written by your brother," Johnny said, gesturing to Shirley, "and I'm going to play it for the whole damn world." The warden stepped forward, his face flushing red. This wasn't approved. This wasn't on the set list. Giving a platform to a convict? It was a violation of protocol. It was subversion. But Johnny didn't look at the warden. He looked at the band. 3, 4. The Tennessee Three kicked into a slow waltzing rhythm. The song was Greystone Chapel. It was a song about finding God inside the prison walls, about the one place where the soul is free even if the body is caged. As Johnny sang the lyrics, "Inside the walls of prison my body may be, but my Lord has set my soul free." The atmosphere in the cafeteria shifted from volatile to sacred. It was a chemical change. The anger evaporated, replaced by a profound, heavy sorrow. Men who hadn't cried since they were boys buried their faces in their hands. They weren't criminals anymore. They were a congregation. And Glenn Shirley? He sat there, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face, watching the most famous outlaw in America sing his words. It was the ultimate validation. It was proof that he existed. The sniper in the catwalk lowered his rifle. He took his eye off the scope. You can't shoot a man for singing a hymn. The guards along the wall relaxed their grip on the batons. The threat of a riot was gone, extinguished not by force but by dignity. Johnny Cash had done the impossible. He had humanized the animals. He had turned a powder keg into a sanctuary. For 3 minutes and 30 seconds, Folsom Prison wasn't a hellhole. It was just a room full of men looking for redemption. When the final chord rang out, there was a second of silence. Then, the prisoners stood up. All of them. It wasn't a rush to the stage. It was an ovation. A standing ovation in a maximum security prison. The sound was deafening, a roar of gratitude that shook the dust from the rafters. Johnny stood there, bathed in sweat, his chest heaving, soaking it in. He looked at the warden and gave a small, tired nod. "I told you," the look said. "Music burns out the infection." The exit was abrupt. The adrenaline crash hit Johnny hard. As soon as he stepped off the stage and back into the dark corridor, his legs gave out. 2 roadies had to catch him, holding him up by his armpits. He was shaking violently, the come-down from the amphetamines colliding with the emotional exhaustion. They hustled him out the back door, past the kitchen, past the trash cans smelling of rot. The guards watched him go, their expressions different now. There was no spitting, no insults. Just a quiet, grudging respect. They had seen him walk into the fire and come out unburned. They loaded him onto the bus. The doors hissed shut, pssh, sealing them back into the safety of the free world. Johnny collapsed into his seat, pulling his black coat tight around him as if he were freezing. The bus pulled away, rolling past the guard towers, past the double gates, past the sign that read, Folsom State Prison. Nobody spoke. The record executives were silent, clutching the master tapes in their laps like they were holy relics. They knew they had captured lightning in a bottle. They knew they had the #1 album in the country. Johnny looked out the window as the prison disappeared into the fog. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper, the lyrics to Shirley's song. He smoothed it out on his knee. He didn't feel like a rock star. He felt like a survivor. He had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had sung back to him. 6 months later, the album at Folsom Prison would be released. It would revitalize his career, turning him into an icon of counterculture. It would force the government to look at prison reform. It would change the face of music history. But as the bus hit the highway that gray January afternoon, Johnny Cash wasn't thinking about history. He was thinking about the men he left behind. He closed his eyes, and in the darkness behind his eyelids, he could still hear the sound of the heavy iron doors slamming shut, ka-clang, a sound that would haunt his rhythm for the rest of his life.